The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was thick and stagnant, heavy with the weight of expectation. Spectators packed the gallery, their hushed whispers a constant hum as they watched the proceedings unfold. At the defendant's table, a young man named Jalen Donovan stood with a casual defiance that seemed too big for his frame. His hands were in his pockets, his chin tilted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Jalen, 19, was accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, but the way Judge Walter Grayson looked at him, it was clear the real trial wasn't about the law. Grayson leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming a lazy rhythm on the polished wood of his desk. He peered over his glasses at Jalen, his face twisted into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You think you're some kind of legal expert," he said, a dry amusement in his voice. "This isn't a debate club." A ripple of laughter swept through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor, they were all in on the joke. Jalen didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He had been preparing for this moment for years. Not exactly this one had never planned on being the defendant. But he knew a courtroom like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, Head memorized case lore. While his friends played video games, he ran mock trials in his head, arguing imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Denise Donovan, had been a paralegal for over 20 years, and Jalen grew up listening to her stories, the corrupt prosecutors, the judges who played favorites, the lawyers who barely tried. By age 14, he had absorbed it all. He could tear apart a court proceeding better than most law students. But to Grayson, none of that mattered. To him, Jalen was just another troubled kid. "Let's make this quick," the judge sighed, flipping through the case file. "I have a golf game at 2 p.m. The crowd laughed again, but this time, something was different. A subtle, almost imperceptible smirk touched Jalen's lips. Grayson had just made his first mistake, but no one else in the room had noticed yet. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington rose from his seat, the picture of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie knotted perfectly, and his voice carried the rehearsed confidence of someone who had given this exact speech 100 times. "The state will prove beyond a reasonable doubt, Your Honor, that the defendant, Jalen Donovan, was caught red-handed in a stolen 2022 Audi A6, which went missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown Los Angeles, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution asserts that the facts speak for themselves." The words landed with a heavy finality. The gallery shifted, their whispers growing louder. On the surface, the case seemed airtight. Stolen car, a chase, an arrest. Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen over his glasses, then back to Carrington. The prosecutor strode toward the jury box, his shined shoes tapping a rhythm on the floor. "The defense may try to convince you this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Donovan is an unfortunate victim of circumstance. But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room ratcheted up. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Jalen didn't blink. Carrington continued, shuffling through a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally saw the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed as stolen, and the arrest was by the book." Grayson exhaled through his nose and nodded. "Sounds straightforward to me." For most people in the room, it was. An open and shut case. But Jalen had spent too many years studying courtrooms not to see the obvious cracks. He remained silent, watching, waiting. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. All right, let's hear the defense's response. He turned to Jalen's public defender, Lisa Thornton, who had barely spoken since she entered the courtroom. She stood, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Your Honor, my client Jalen placed a hand on her shoulder, and she trailed off. He sat down, and for the first time, he spoke. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. An absolute silence fell over the courtroom. Grayson stared at him, a look of pure astonishment on his face. Jalen's voice was calm and steady. I'll be my own defense. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Carrington's smirk wavered for a split second before he laughed sharply. This should be entertaining. But nobody laughed when Jalen took his first step forward. The atmosphere in the courtroom tightened around him. He still had his hands in his pockets, and he let the silence stretch, just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, he finally spoke. Your Honor, before I begin, I would like to clarify something with the prosecution. He took another slow step forward. You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct? Carrington scoffed. I'm getting bored. Yes. And that testimony is recorded in his report? Of course it is. Jalen turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I move to have that testimony struck from evidence. Grayson squinted, trying to follow the play. Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A flash of confusion crossed Carrington's face. What are you talking about? Jalen took another step forward. Your Honor, if the court would permit me, I'd like to file a motion to subpoena Officer Ruiz's GPS tracker records for that night. If his report says he saw me in the car, then it should line up with his location history. But I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Grayson frowned, his gaze shifting to Carrington. The prosecutor cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. This report was made by a law enforcement officer, Your Honor. Are we to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Jalen shrugged slightly, almost casually. If the officer was where he claimed to be, the GPS data will prove it. If he wasn't, Grayson studied him for a long moment, then turned to Carrington. Does the prosecution have any objection to the officer's GPS data being checked? Carrington hesitated, and the pause stretched on. The jury noticed. The spectators noticed. And most importantly, the judge noticed. Jalen had no doubt that if Carrington was confident he was right, he wouldn't have hesitated. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. Carrington finally shook his head. No objection, Your Honor. But the shift had already happened. For the first time, no one in the courtroom was laughing. The tension was palpable. Carrington shuffled his papers, his flawless confidence finally showing a crack. Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains, the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Jalen nodded, his face expressionless. That's true. He took a step closer to the jury box. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. The prosecution wants you to believe my fingerprints in the car mean I stole it. But let's think about it logically. He took a deep breath, his voice calm and measured. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You stick your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up. Then you put it back on the rack and leave. A few hours later, someone steals that jacket. The fact is, your fingerprints are on it. Does that mean you're the thief? A few jurors exchanged glances. Jalen didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside of a convenience store 11 hours before it was reported stolen. I was at that store with 3 friends. And yes, as we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was unlocked. I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. I just had a moment of foolish curiosity. He paused, letting the thought hang in the air. Then he asked, if you touched something, does that make you a criminal? Carrington cleared his throat, fumbling through his notes, searching for anything to regain control. Jalen wasn't done. And while we're on the subject, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was performed. Was the forensic expert on this case subpoenaed to testify, Your Honor? He turned to Grayson. The judge blinked, caught off guard by the question, and looked at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly answered, no. Jalen pursed his lips. So let me be clear. The state is using forensic results to convict me, but they didn't feel it was necessary to bring in the actual expert who processed that evidence. I have no opportunity to cross-examine them, to ask about the chain of custody, or to question the accuracy of the analysis. Carrington's jaw clenched. Jalen nodded as if that was all he needed to hear. Interesting, Judge Grayson sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was a man who now realized this case was far from routine. But Jalen wasn't finished. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce a piece of evidence, the official statement from the vehicle's owner, Mr. Raymond Whitaker. He gave a statement to police that, for some reason, was not presented in the prosecution's materials. And I believe I know why. Jalen turned to Carrington. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told the police the night his car was reported stolen? Carrington gritted his teeth. He knew exactly what was coming. Jalen didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he pulled a printed transcript from a folder and read aloud, I left the car running when I ran into the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and drove off. But it wasn't the kid you arrested. I saw that guy, and he was white. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Jalen held up the paper. This is from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. He turned to Judge Grayson. The arresting officer acknowledged this in his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet, they want the jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even fit the description of the actual thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Carrington stepped forward, scrambling. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was apprehended driving the vehicle. Jalen shook his head. I was not. His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the courtroom with stunning precision. I was arrested several blocks from where the car was abandoned, walking home after grabbing a bite to eat with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is poor police work and assumptions. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath. He rubbed his temple. The case was falling apart, and everyone knew it. Jalen turned to the jury. The real suspect got away that night. The police found a black teenager in the same general area and decided that was close enough. That's the entire point of this case. Silence. Grayson cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Does the prosecution have anything else? Carrington stood rigid, his face flushed. "No, Your Honor." Judge Grayson sighed. He looked at Jalen for a long moment, then glanced at the jury. He leaned forward and spoke words that would stick with everyone in that room. "Case dismissed." For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then, chaos erupted. Jalen let the moment settle, allowing everyone to absorb the reality. Judge Grayson, his gavel still in his hand, looked at Jalen with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a flicker of recognition, maybe even regret. Jalen met his gaze, then turned to walk away. But before he reached the door, the judge spoke again. "Mr. Donovan." Jalen stopped but didn't turn around. Grayson paused, then finally said, "You should consider law school." Jalen didn't have to think about it. He already was.